So if you have a question for anybody on the panel, go ahead and raise your hand, and Nicole will bring you the mic.
Just extending the question I had, and kind of also wrapping back to the earlier great presentation, but actually both were great.
Before you ask, I just want to say. Before you ask, I just want to say, like, whoever asks a question, I'm happy to give out a book, even if it's a question for anybody else on this panel. Just let me know, and yeah, so feel free.
All right, so a question I do have to ask, and it's a real major question, and it has to do with maybe more depth off stack, is how much performance are you seeing overall with your framework? What's it really looking like in tens of milliseconds? Because there's a change in what the performance we're going to need with a model that's strictly focused in that design pattern versus one that's more of a Flutter, protected memory threads, sockets, local storage, WebRTC type model versus something that's more of a controlled model. So, what does it look like on the real world performance? Because microsecond infrastructure is going to have to be here now to handle what's happening with 5G. So,
and I think this will be a joint answer. I know Justin can also talk about the performance of lit element, but performance truly is like a full spectrum approach, right? You have to understand it's a question that you have to ask and answer before you start building. But in the case that you are building a new section of your application, it's important to take into consideration. The component controller model is unique, whereas as your application scales and as your DOM state scales, you may have like tons of components in your DOM. You don't, in my experience, it was frustrating to have to pass state down, as well as there are unintended kind of cases where people might put code that doesn't belong in the render, or side effects of the render in the render function or in the should update function or things like that. So, right, and so we just try and skip that and just as precisely as possible render. But renders are cheap and bindings are cheap, so it doesn't matter too much. However, we have seen that okay, if your tree is very deep, you want to try and be precise. I mean, that's, yeah. Right. Yeah, and our goal was basically you have a huge application state, and we want to create a one-to-one relationship between data and its presentation and, just O of one update. That's. Honestly, I'll probably pass this one off. I mean, Justin, do you want to? I don't know too much about how it looks. In my framework. Can you say that one more time?
So how much do you have limits on how much best practices, how much data people should pass through to prevent them from?
Oh no. Yeah, we want you to go full throttle. Like I pass in like a 10 meg state, and we're trying to deal with it. I mean, we are designing our platform to work inside of native apps, which pass ridiculous amounts of state all the time. That's really the challenge, and that kind of grew from, hey, here's a 20,000 person group chat. How do you make that function well? I mean, so those are lessons learned that we just try to build in. But yeah. Okay.
Like the cold fusion.
Yeah. Yep.
A question.
Yeah, sure.
Question for Ben.
Yeah.
I'd really like to, I've used A-Frame, 3JS, and I haven't used Babylon, but one thing that I've thought about in using a lot of them is that it seems that we're such as the megabytes of library, of framework to do something, but it's using like not exactly the best way to do something, like using JavaScript to do something that CSS should do. Like, why don't we have these bends going on, and we have so much depth available with CSS3 and CSS4, whatever. Why would we do something in JavaScript when we should be doing much more in CSS, taking advantage of that, GPU, et cetera, et cetera? And then the second question, that's the question for you first, and then after that, why would anyone use components when the thought is for using the broad appeal? I think that people like the butt and seat use React, use Angular, use Vue, use whatever, because you already know how to do it. So what is the argument for using web components, which I'm all for 100%, but just to speak to that point. But first, CSS.
Sure, first CSS. I love CSS. CSS is awesome. I love doing CSS transforms. But the problem is if you have a complex 3D model, you can't load that. If you load that complex 3D model into CSS, I mean, it would be like you're looking at it from one perspective. And if you try to rotate that with CSS transforms, you're going to be looking at it like it's skewed. It's not going to be from a different side. So we're talking about like, fake 2D, what you can do with CSS.
Can't you just rewrite this stuff? I know we have the speed now, 60 frames, 120 frames per second, whatever we're going to go. We could rewrite this stuff faster than you can write into,
So I used to do this way back when I was building CD-ROMs, and we did fake 3D, and you could render out a bunch of different 2D sprites and accomplish that same goal. And you could probably, it would be a lot of different images that you'd render, and it's just not a full 3D scene.
more powerful, and you have all your interactivity that you can see.
It's a big world to explain, so that's cool. What's that?
If you want, Chris has been, we could add a little bit. Yeah, so Ben mentioned Model Viewer as an example of a web component managing 3D stuff. And a teammate of ours, Chris, has been working on that. And recently he's been kind of experiencing some of these things about the barrier between 3D and CSS. And a lot of this comes down to that, like, there's still these boundaries in there that are difficult to deal with. Like, for instance, CSS is nice because things inherit and cascade, but you might need values or to observe these values at timings that you can't observe in CSS. Like, we don't have a way to observe a CSS property changing, so you need to feed that in via JavaScript or an attribute. And interactivity is a good point, too, because you don't have kind of declarative interactivity in 3D scenes yet. But one thing Chris has been doing recently, which is really awesome, is figuring out a way that in your 3D model, you can describe an interactivity point, and it will like automatically instantiate some DOM to be able to capture the interactivity, the events, and display that, and use CSS transforms in the 3JS CSS renderer to try to get that to basically match the same 3D rotation that you have in your model. So there's work.
The CSS 3D plugin for 3JS back in the day.
Yeah.
He's actually using it.
Yeah, so there's some barriers there, and it'd be nice if, everything was smooth bidirectionally between these things. And, right now it just requires some, like, work and scripting to get around.
Plus, it's just latency. You're looking at situations that are pulling up the browser and other tools, an actual GPU or an instance chip. If you're moving it, especially like a VR account you got, you just can't keep up with it with eventual consistency with performance. So, there's some things that just with the speed of light. That's why microsecond infrastructure is local and also across the web.
Yep, just for the benefit, we're recording all of this so that people can watch afterwards. And I as tempting as it is to have back and forth conversations, no one on the video is going to be able to hear comments here. So let's try and just stick to sort of question answer, and then more back and forth we can do afterwards.
Yes, a question for Ben. What's your take on the augmented reality with the web components?
With augmented reality with what?
AR.
VR.
No.
With VR?
No, AR.
Oh, with
augmented reality.
What's my take on augmented reality? So, as I work for Adobe, we have a great augmented reality platform called Arrow. Personally, I latched onto VR really quickly because you're in this immersive space. You're shutting off the entire world, and that's kind of my preference because like. AR right now without the head-mounted glasses, you're looking at it through a phone, so it's a weird form factor. Like it just feels weird to me. It's not as immersive. Like I want to be immersed, but AR is more it's more utilitarian. I feel like I think they released a measuring. I think Apple might have released like a measuring tool, so I can like measure distance across my floor to hang up photos. So I think it's a difference between kind of entertainment and utilitarian stuff, and I think that distinction will go away, but I think the form factor of the smartphone needs to go away to accomplish that. Someone agrees with me.
All right, over here. Another question for Ben. Sorry for that. Is there, like, you talked a bit about your Lit XR part, and I thought the demo was really cool. Is this open source or something that other people can play with? Are you planning to open source it? Just like overall the idea of like being able to use web components and then moving them into
Yeah,
the
so
XR space.
yeah, so the question is am I open sourcing it? It's open sourced right now. I mean, a lot of these projects I do, I don't know if you should take this project seriously because it's based on a stupid hack, right? But it works, and that's my like what's going on in my head. But it's up on my GitHub repo, and I called it LitXR, and you can play around with it now if you want. I'll keep working on it, but who knows if anybody's going to use it.
Hey, great. I actually want to just loop back to a statement that was, or a question that was asked earlier. Why use web components when people are like, butt in seat using like React or Angular or things like that? So with Runtime, our platform and Lit Element and all different types of web components, the goal is universal integratability, right? So we work with two development firms, Sonova and Lausanne, and they have across the platform just frameworks, like all different types, right? Old, new, versions this, version that, right? So we say, okay, how can we enable them to continue their velocity and develop new products and extend their existing products without having to continue to invest in older technology that might not be, a spec or native to the browser. So that's really the goal, in my eyes, at least. I don't know. Does anyone else want to talk on that?
No, I mean, my last job before Adobe was at GE, and we had this situation where it was like we had a bunch of developers that wanted to use their own frameworks, and we're kind of come to that point where web components are that central thing that's accepted. It's the universal thing that's accepted everywhere. So like even if you like that framework, but you don't like the framework your friend is using, there's this common middle ground, and I think web components accomplish that in a big way.
Yep.
Hi, my question is regarding the future now. So for standard side of things, so things like adopted style sheets and dynamic imports of HTML, like HTML modules, what do you think are the real obstacles for general
I'm gonna regale you with things from this weekend, and I'll let the rest of the panel take it. So I just tried. I'm using dynamic imports for that Babylon scene thing I did, and I'm using Babylon scene in the WebVR demo I gave. And I realized this weekend I can't bundle this because I'm using dynamic imports, and it's written as a string in my attribute. I'm like, I don't know how to use rollup to bundle this. So that was one of my hurdles this weekend, and I'll.
I mean, the first thing is just to set the level of where we are today with Edge being released, 3 weeks ago now. We have a situation we haven't had before where like all the current browsers support this baseline, right? And so now it's about kind of incrementally improving from that baseline, solving specific use cases. And so from that point of view, it's like a great position to be in because for the past few years, we've had a really good collaborative effort with all the browsers coming together once or twice a year, maybe 3 times if you count like the web components face-to-face and TPack, and really working on individual features. You bring up adopted style sheets, and that's an interesting case because like there was recently, kind of a flare-up of disagreement on the shape of the API. And so we're keeping an eye on that. Like, Chrome is very eager to basically like keep forward progress going. And if you see some of the Chrome people on Twitter and whatnot, they're like, we really support standards, but on the other hand, we want forward momentum, and so we don't want to get, there's a balance to achieve there, right? So that you're not kind of stuck. And, that can result in sometimes like some things not, being perfectly agreed on when they ship, and then you're seeing a process now of that being ironed out. I think the big thing for us as a library vendor on top of that is to try to enable you to use the very most cutting edge stuff that is solving really important use cases, but at the same time buffer you and protect you from, any bumps along the way. And then to, act as that funnel of feedback from our developers to the standards process to say like, yes, this really is an important feature. Let's all get on the same page and figure it out. And obviously the thing we want to avoid most is like a web components v0 type situation. But I mean, I'm optimistic. I think there's always going to be like, you have, at least 4, but probably more realistically, like a half dozen or more, entities involved in these discussions, and there's always going to be some, level of agreement and disagreement. I'm optimistic, though.
Yep.
Were you interested in specific like features or just the general? Yeah. Yeah. So there's a TPack meeting that's coming up in March. I'm sorry, Web Components Face to Face. Sorry, meetup coming up in March. So we're kind of preparing. To be able to talk about, I think, custom elements, scope registries, and declarative shadow roots, and so we're kind of preparing to bring kind of the voice of everyone here. And if you have, if you have specific things like HTML modules that you want to see, definitely come grab us and tell us your use case so that you can empower us to come advocate for the Web Components users. But there are a couple of our pet features that we're planning on trying to kind of advance the discussion.
I can real quick give a specific update on what's going on there. So it's really great to have Microsoft in the Chromium fold because they spend a lot of time managing things with Edge, and I think they're freed up a little bit, and they're very enthusiastic about web components and things like HTML modules. HTML and CSS modules, for people who don't know, they're basically a way to load HTML and CSS via the JavaScript module system. So you can import them into a JavaScript module and then use them. That got hung up on a security analysis that said, well, if somebody imports CSS and they expect it not to evaluate as script, somebody could change that file's MIME type to JavaScript and then get it to execute, and they wouldn't be expecting that. Could be a security problem. So now there is a proposal in TC39 to be able to tag your imports as the type of import you expect. That's working its way through. That was presented at the last TC39 meeting. It's going up again at the Hawaii meeting next month. So these things are being worked on, and there's progress. And Microsoft is working on HTML modules like very heavily. So again, standards are slow, but there's progress.
I've got a question for Savo. I think what you're talking about with breaking state from being a tree into a graph is super cool because there's a lot of like performance from passing things down. But I wonder what you do to deal with cycles. Is that something that you allow? And if so, do you have any advice or tooling to help developers deal with cycles that crop up in their applications?
Yeah, for us, for us, I mean, it's up to the implementer, right, of your controller. However, internally with us, right now, the most that we use the graph nature of is primarily for shared controllers and controllers that are linked to each other. And because this is change-driven architecture, if every controller has the state, it won't like keep circling. It's like everyone's at the same state, we're good to go. But it will until everything has the same state. So think like dark mode, theme, like accessibility, stuff like that. We don't really care about like cyclic, event or loops in our graph. But at the same time, if you wanted to build like stop cases in and pass in, like each of our controllers have unique UIDs, you could pass that in and say, hey, have I seen this? Is it starting to cycle? Stop it right then and there. But in our case, it's not really a problem. Yeah, cool. Did that kind of answer your question, or if not, no worries. Yeah.
Yeah. So like the state management is where most of the cycles will crop up, and there it's not a problem because it's all simultaneous. And otherwise, there's tools like the UUID.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Cool.
We have time for one or two.
Yeah.
Hi, yeah, the last was about Sava's thing about embedding native apps. And do you have a query method where basically, for example, the capacity, for example, is it going to have, like, for example, an entire kernel, for example, say if it's, you're running on a Mac, but it's a Windows app or something like that, is it going to have a Windows kernel embedded with it? And also, is there also going to be an ability to query if the device is capable? Because if I have my old Galaxy S3, it's just going to probably crash and you try to run a Photoshop app on it.
Right. So we're not taking native apps and putting them in the cloud. We're taking the cloud and we're bringing it into native apps. So basically, operating systems and they have web views, right? And our goal is to utilize those web views within a native application, create some type of bidirectional bridge, and then augment the native application with capabilities of the cloud. So think distributed processing, sharing, things like that, ways that you can start to extend native apps and make them available in the cloud, but also have cloud-oriented features within themselves. Yeah.
think we have time for one more. Did I see one here? Yeah.
Do you see web components as being like a complicated technology that we use frameworks to, like libraries to solve, or do you see libraries as a bridge to get people to use the native technologies like web components?
So, I mean, web components are very much a rather simple, low-level feature of the web platform. They basically just give you a first-class way for the first time to extend the vocabulary of HTML, if you will. And as such, they're very flexible, but they don't try to give you a developer experience that would be comparable to what you would get out of a library or a framework. And in fact, they're not opinionated really with respect to how you, for example, render the contents of a component. And so, you know, there are definitely use cases. We encourage everyone to understand the nuts and bolts of how the low-level APIs work, because that's just helpful. But for most use cases, we think people will have the most success picking a library or a tool that helps them you know, become productive more quickly with web components. And that manifests as either a web component-specific library or tool chain or framework. Does anyone want to add anything to that?
I also think an important part of that is empowering people not through additional code, but through patterns that people can just get really easily and then just maintain those. I think that's a really important part of the story here. And I mean, if you learn a pattern, you can apply it everywhere, right? And that's really helped me in my career because basically my entire developer career was based on patterns, not frameworks and libraries. Yeah, that's just something that I think.
Yeah, I'll just only add that, like, I think you kind of touched on one of the biggest misperceptions, you know, about web components is that a lot of people think that they're designed to solve the exact same stack of problems that you have that a framework solves. And really, web components, like at least currently, they're very low level, right? They basically tell you like where to do stuff, which is the component instance, and when to do it, which is the lifecycle callbacks. But they don't tell you what to do at all in those things, right? They're just hooks that allow you to do whatever you need. And from there, you do what you want, and a lot of people are like, well, it's just going to be manual DOM manipulation, which is only true if you're not using like a helper library to do declarative rendering, which is exactly why we built lit-HTML, or why it's not actually a crazy idea to run like React or Preact inside of a web component. So I think the biggest thing the web components give us is a standard way of saying when and where, and then a little bit about some structure about encapsulation so that you have the inside of a component, which you implement with whatever you want, and the outside of the component, which is the interoperable surface of it. I think if we can communicate that better, we will do a much better job for selling web components this year.
All right, and with that, we'll wrap it up. We're going to be hanging out as we sort of shut down here, so feel free to come up and ask questions of any of us. And thank you very much for coming out, and we hope to see you again in a few months. We'll announce when the next meetup is going to be, and definitely get your talk suggestions in if any of you want to speak at the next one of these, and do let us know via the feedback form how we did. Oh yeah, also, Savo points out that there are cool mesh shirts over there and the other swag too. So thanks again.